We are standing in the first of 10 new galleries in what is a completely renovated museum that you rededicated last year with Presidents Bush and Carter, built at your insistence with privately raised money, no taxpayer dollars involved. And this is the prologue to the story. An unlikely setting, maybe, a 1970s disco. And of course, the point we were trying to make here is that you would be called upon to try to heal a country that was culturally as well as politically divided. How aware were you? You had teenage children in the house. I mean, the popular culture. Was that something that you were well aware of?
With 4 children from probably 20-something down to about 12 or 13, 3 boys and Susan, our dining room table was well aware of the attitude of the youth during that very tough time of Watergate and Vietnam. We had the typical children's haircut, long hair. We had the typical clothes that they wore in those days. It was very evident to Betty and me that we had teenagers that were in the swim of what young people were doing all over the country.
Now, we think back to the late 60s and early 70s, and it was a time of real cultural division in this country. But, you know, you were from Grand Rapids, Michigan, which is not thought of as a hotbed of protest or dissent. But you were back here a lot. What was it like during the Vietnam War, latter stage of the Vietnam War and Watergate, when you came back to Michigan? I mean, what were you exposed to here in terms of the political mood?
It was different here than in, say, Washington, D.C., or any other large metropolitan city like Chicago or L.A. or maybe New York City. Grand Rapids had a long tradition of reasonably moderate sociological ideas, activities, very stable community. But at the same time, there was a new generation growing up, quite different from the generation of my wife Betty and myself. So although you would see a different part of America in the late 1960s or the early 1970s, when you come to Grand Rapids, than you did or you could remember back in the 1930s, 40s, and thereabout. We had 1 or 2 riots here. We had a racial disturbance that was not of long duration, but it was an expression of the black community that they thought things were not proper here in this Western Michigan community. So Grand Rapids was sort of a miniature image of the country as a whole during the late 1960s and early 1970s.
Did you have any trouble going on to college campuses?
I had no trouble here in this congressional district. I went to Calvin, I went to Hope, I went to Aquinas. Yes, there were young people in those 3 colleges who had very, very strong anti-Vietnam War views, but the conduct of the students was quite different, much more moderate than when I went to Wichita State in 1973 and was really just drowned out by the protesters. In fact, the meeting was postponed a week by the president because he anticipated a very violent potential protest by the student bodies. I went there a week later. I was given a hard time, but at least it was civil enough so I could finish my remarks.
You mentioned discussions at home. Was there debate around the family dinner table, say on Vietnam War?
Yes.
Were there members of the Ford family who were opposed to the U.S. policy in the
Our
war?
son Jack was the most in opposition. He was always sort of the one that had conflicts with his mother and father about the war in Vietnam, about social issues. It's paradoxical. Now that he's a businessman in Southern California, he has very different views and is probably at least a moderate, if not a conservative, philosophically. The other children, Mike was very restrained. Steve was a little too young at that time, and Susan was equally on the young side.
You know, I think probably all America wants to know, Mr. President, have you ever been in a disco?
Have I ever what?
Been in a disco?
Oh, sure. I've taken Betty to more than one disco.
Have you really?
She likes to dance, and so do I. We don't try to keep up with with the footwork of the
That's right. She was a Martha Graham dancer, wasn't
well,
she?
she was a professional dancer when she was 18, 19 years old, and she still is a very outstanding dancer and makes up for my own deficiencies.
The other thing I think people want to know, you're talking about pop culture.
Mm-hmm.
If you look down here in this case, right behind you, we have gathered sort of items from the period, and I think I have to know, do you still own a leisure suit?
No,
No?
no, that has disappeared somehow.
Was that
Although
deliberate?
we had several of them.
Okay.
I'm not sure that I look too well in them, but that's what people wore.
Is it possible Mrs. Ford might have cleaned out the closet, or?
She has a knack of doing that. Well, without my permission or observance.
We'll head on to the next
All right.
gallery. Mr. President, we've come into what we call the Watergate gallery, and there's a quote here from you, which the viewers can read for themselves. But basically, you told the truth. You expected others to be truthful with you. Some people reading that, in light of what we know in the history books, will suggest that maybe it was a naive viewpoint. How would you respond to that?
I can understand someone thinking it was naive, but it was the way I felt. And when I look back over my political career, I think it was an important ingredient that contributed to my success. Every time I am introduced by some people who knew me when I was in the Congress, Democrat or Republican, and they make some public announcement or they introduce me, truth is always a part of their introduction. I think that's a pretty good characteristic to have hung around your neck.
Is it fair to say then maybe 30, 40 years ago when you were first coming into Congress that a lot of members of Congress felt that way, that it was then still an institution where a man's bond could be trusted, that it was an institution that ran on that kind of implicit understanding?
In the 1940s, 50s, when I first went to Congress, there was a totally different atmosphere than exists today. There was a respect between individuals, Democrats and Republicans, or Democrats with Democrats, or Republicans with Republicans. There was a certain rapport that developed trust. And when you talk about trust, I think you have to include truthfulness, accuracy, and I have some apprehension that that same atmosphere does not prevail in the 1990s in the legislative branch of the federal government.
When did you first meet Richard Nixon?
I was sworn in January 3rd, 1948, following my election in November of 1948. I was 49.
Yep.
January 1949, I was sworn in the well of the House by Speaker Sam Rayburn, along with all the other new members of the House. As soon as I finished taking the oath, a person walked up to me and he said, "I'm Dick Nixon, Congressman from California. I would like to meet you." That was my first meeting with Congressman Nixon, and it was the beginning of a long-time personal friendship.
These are the original burglar tools used in the Watergate break-in. Do you remember where you were when you first learned about the break-in and your own initial reaction?
If my memory is correct, the break-in occurred on a Saturday night. I was in California making a speech. I heard about it on Sunday, flying back. From the news stories, I couldn't believe any such stupid action would be taken by any Republican Party individual. When I got back to Washington, I immediately contacted my office. I read the Washington newspapers, so I filled myself in as much as I could. That Monday morning, I had a meeting with John Mitchell, who had been Nixon's Attorney General but had resigned to run his campaign in 1972. I went to the meeting. It was 8 o'clock in the morning on Monday. Nobody was there but John Mitchell and myself. I knew John very well. I said to him, "What about this break-in?" He said, "I know nothing about it." I said, "John, did you know about it? Did you participate in it?" "Absolutely not." He reassured me emphatically. Well, that was pretty good evidence that at least he, as Attorney General, and he was at one time, had no involvement whatsoever. So that was my first clear-cut statement by someone that close to the president that he had not been involved. Now, later, over the years, from June of 1972, I asked other people, including President Nixon. And in each case, the individuals that I questioned said they had no connection whatsoever with the Watergate break-in.
You knew, not well, but I guess you knew Gordon Liddy, didn't you? What was the nature of that?
I unfortunately knew him. In 1970, I think, a congressman from that New York State area was running for re-election. He came from a well-known old family.
Ham fish.
Ham Fish.
Yeah.
His father had been a famous congressman. Ham Fish Jr. was then the congressman. Gordon Liddy decided to run against him in the primary. And he, according to the experts, was a formidable challenger. So Ham Fish asked me, as the Republican House leader, to come up and campaign for him. I went up and campaigned in the New York district affirmatively for Ham Fish, indirectly condemning
Liddy. Or-
Gordon Liddy.
Yeah.
So Hamfish won the primary, but then Gordon Liddy threatened to run as an independent, which if had taken place with an independent, a Republican, and a Democrat, the Democrat probably would have won. So the Hamfish people asked me to try and get Liddy a job in Washington. I didn't like the idea because I had learned to be somewhat disgusted with Gordon Liddy. So nevertheless, I contacted the Department of Justice to see if there was some position. Eventually, he got a job, a temporary job over with the Department of Justice. And Hamfish went on and won the election. I always was a bit embarrassed by doing that in light of the subsequent actions of Gordon Liddy, but when I got him the job, he had not yet then been involved in Watergate.
Did it make you even more nervous when you heard that among those involved in the break-in was Gordon Liddy?
Well,
I mean, knowing what you knew or suspecting what you suspected.
well, when his name surfaced at the time of the break-in, I was more than certain that he was involved and that it was a bad operation.
One of the other artifacts that we have on display here is one of President Nixon's White House tape recorders, actually used in the Oval Office. When did you find out? Did you find out at the same time that everyone else did during Alexander Butterfield's testimony that in fact there were bugs in the Oval Office?
That was the first knowledge that I had that there were tapes in the White House. I was shocked. I couldn't believe it. I wondered why that kind of an operation would be in the president's office and the other parts of the White House. It made no sense to me.
Now, when you moved into the Oval Office, I understand one of the first things you did was get rid of these.
Within a very few minutes after I took the oath of office, walked into the Oval Office, I told Al Haig and Don Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney, get rid of those taping machines. We'll not have it in the White House in my administration. Now, what's interesting, about 2 weeks later, one of my staff inadvertently found that one of the pieces of the recording equipment was still in the woodwork. And he was furious because he knew my position. And he raised the devil with the proper authorities, and it was kicked out of the White House promptly. But it does illustrate you can make a very tough decision and expect things to be done totally, and a slip will happen, and
Sure.
It won't be done the way you wanted it.
Now, to be fair, of course, to Nixon, he was not the only president who taped conversations. We now know that a number of presidents have done so. And yet, do you think it's safe to assume that no future president will ever resort to taping?
Well,
in
my
that
best
fashion?
recollection from news accounts, Johnson did taping, Kennedy did taping, so there was a precedent well before Nixon that a president could tape conversations in the White House without others knowing their voices were being recorded. I hope my action in terminating the taping established a new precedent that taping will never exist in the president's office.
What kind of relationship did you have with Vice President Agnew, who you would, of course, be called on to replace?
I had a reasonably good relationship. He was originally, back in the 60s, a well-known county commissioner in Maryland, over in the Baltimore area. Then he got elected governor of Maryland in somewhat of a surprise election, but turned out to be a good governor. During that campaign for the governorship, he asked me to come over and campaign for him, which I was glad to do. I then got acquainted with him. And then when he was nominated for vice president, I was a bit surprised, but he was elected vice president, not once, but twice. So coming from a county commissioner to a governor to vice president, 2 elections was a pretty good track record.
Now, there were some people in that back in '68 who were talking about you as a possible running mate with Richard Nixon. But actually, that wasn't the first time that you had been boomed for the vice presidency, was it? I mean, back in 1960, wasn't there also some talk?
In the 1960 convention in Chicago, where Nixon ran the first time, the vice presidency was a wide open field. Going into Chicago, Nixon had not indicated any pre-choice. There was a field of about 4 or 5, and my Michigan delegation thought it would be a good gesture to nominate me. Well, that was a little too optimistic back in 1960, but they were very dedicated, and so we proceeded. Now, during the convention hours, Nixon dropped the name of Henry Cabot Lodge as his prospective choice. I was asked to attend a meeting after Nixon's nomination by the convention to help decide the vice presidential nominee. It was a canned operation. Nixon went through the routine. I was there. Thurston Morton of Tennessee was there. I don't know, 2 or 3 others, and Cabot Lodge. Well, it was very obvious right from the beginning that Cabot Lodge was Nixon's choice, so it ended up with that being the choice by the group there, and Lodge became the vice presidential nominee.
And a lot of people now will look back. I suspect even Richard Nixon might have acknowledged in later years that he made a mistake in picking Lodge.
Well, Cabot Lodge was a fine person and an excellent senator, but he was not a hard-working campaigner for the vice presidency after he got the choice. He might have been more active, and if he would, maybe Nixon would have been elected.
Now, we're in the fall of 1973, and a lot of people probably don't realize you had basically decided that you never wanted to be president, you didn't want to be vice president, you wanted to be Speaker of the House. And that was a goal that was probably beyond your reach. So you and Mrs. Ford had already made plans to, in effect, call it a career, hadn't you?
Well, after 5 times trying to be the Speaker and losing 5 times because we didn't have enough Republicans in the House, I decided, after sitting down and having a very good conversation with Betty, that it would be futile to try one more time to be Speaker. It would be better to be reelected in 1974, serve 2 more years, end my career after 28 years in the House of Representatives. That made sense. So those were our plans come the spring of 1973.
And then Vice President Agnew gets into trouble, is the subject of an investigation. How did you learn of his legal problems, and at what point did it appear that, in fact, you might be chosen to replace him?
Well, rumors started in the Washington press that Vice President Agnew had been involved in some mishandling of campaign money. There was no concrete evidence, but pretty substantial rumors. Then one day, President Nixon called me and asked me to come down and spend some time with him in his private office in the executive office building. I wondered what the purpose was. I went down, it was early afternoon. I walked into his private office. He was smoking a pipe. He didn't smoke a pipe often. And he turned to me and he said, "Why don't you light your pipe up, Jerry?" At that time, I was smoking a pipe. So we sat there for almost 2 hours, talking very friendly about our friendship, our political careers, what our futures might be. And then he got into the problem of Mr. Agnew's campaign money problems. And I got a full picture on what the Department of Justice knew about how Agnew had handled the campaign funds. They were much, much worse than I ever imagined or had been reported in the papers. It shocked me, to be honest with you, the transfer of money in the White House itself. Well, then I got a notice from my staff that there was a vote on the floor of the House, which meant that I had to get back because I was the Republican leader. So I immediately left a meeting with Nixon and went back to the Capitol. As I walked in, 3 or 4 friends of mine, Al Cederberg and others, grabbed me and said, "Agnew's resigned, Agnew's resigned." Well, then the picture all unfolded. The question then became who was going to be Nixon's nominee to replace Agnew under the 25th Amendment. Conley was a potential, but he had problems because of the so-called milk scandal. Reagan was a possibility, but he was much too conservative for a number of Republicans. Rockefeller was a third possibility, but he was too liberal for a lot of Republicans. About that time, within 24 hours, all my friends in the House of Representatives started a petition, and they got every member of the House on our side, Republican side, to sign this petition and send it to President Nixon. Well, after I think 2 days, maybe 3, Nixon called me down to the White House and said that Agnew was out and that he was going to nominate me. The interesting thing is, he said, now, we'll announce it tonight in the East Room. But he said, I'm not going to tell anybody, and you're not going to tell anybody. So you go home, and you just plan to come with Betty to the reception in the East Room of the White House. So I went home, we're having dinner, and we had 2 phones in our house in Alexandria, Virginia. The upper phone had no extensions. That phone rings, our daughter Susan answers it, and she yells downstairs, Dad, the White House is calling, the President wants to talk to you. So I dash upstairs.
Now, at this point, Mrs. Ford doesn't know.
Betty doesn't know.
Okay.
So I pick up the phone, and it's President Nixon. He said, can I put Betty on the line? I say, well, Mr. President, this phone has no extension. Can you call back on the other line, and I'll put Betty on? Well, the White House calls back on the other line. I get on, Betty gets on, Nixon tells her about my nomination.
How did she take the news?
Well, I think she was in shock, because neither she nor I had really any ambitions or intentions, but she was always a great, great, good soldier, so it meant she had to hurry, finish dinner, get dressed, get down there in time to have the event take place.
And were the kids excited?
Oh, yes. There were only 2 of them home, Susan and Steve. The rest of them, Jack and Mike, were in college. But it was an exciting moment.
Now, I don't want to get ahead of ourselves, but I will ask you, at that point, when you were chosen to be vice president, did you have any suspicion that sooner or later you might be living in the White House?
I have to be very honest, very frank. Neither Betty nor I had any expectation, anticipation that we would end up being President and First Lady. There was no evidence that would lead us to that expectation.
Having introduced the period and the Watergate scandal that made you president, in this next gallery, we take visitors through your life story, beginning not in Grand Rapids. A lot of people might be surprised that you were not born in Grand Rapids. You were born in Omaha, Nebraska, and in fact, you were not born Gerald Ford. Can you tell us about
Well, my mother, when she was a very young schoolgirl, really, about 19 years old, married Leslie King of Omaha, Nebraska. And she left school after her marriage, went back to Omaha, and I was born there in Omaha in July of 1913, about a year or so after my mother and father were married. So I was born Leslie King, Jr. Now, unfortunately, my mother was badly abused, mentally, verbally, physically, by my father. He was an extremely jealous individual. There were many instances where she just casually spoke to somebody, and he went into a rage. He had a terrible temper and was extremely jealous of her. Well, after I was born in July of 1913, he had continued this abuse. Within a month after my birth, she took me and went by train alone from Omaha to Grand Rapids, Michigan. That was a courageous action on her part, but it was the only way she could escape my father's constant abuse of her mentally as well as physically. So she went to Grand Rapids, where my grandfather and grandmother, her parents, lived. And she lived with them, or we lived with them for a short time. And about a year and a half or 2 years later, she married my stepfather, who turned out to be a magnificent parent as far as I was concerned.
Now, this is a picture of you as an infant and your mother, Dorothy. What was she like?
She was a very, very attractive young lady, beautiful face, nice body. She had a superb personality, very outgoing, very friendly. She could have been a politician in her own right.
Really?
She loved people. She loved to be part of organizations. She was a great role model for me.
Now, somewhere I heard she died in church on a Sunday morning, and they went back and found her appointment books were full for several weeks.
She belonged to more organization in Grand Rapids than any person alive. The Garden Club, the City Club, I don't know, on and on and on. And she was a goer and a doer. One Sunday, I think it was in 1972, she went to 11 o'clock service at, I believe, Grace Church. And during the sermon, she had a heart attack and dropped dead. And when my sister-in-laws went to help clean out her apartment, they looked at her date book, and here she was, 70-something. She had engagements every noon, every night for the next 4 or 5 months. She was a real active, super wonderful mother.
Now, your dad, you're a stepdad, but as far as you're concerned, really your dad, Gerald Ford Sr. This is the Ford Paint and Varnish Company, which actually we've recreated here as part of the exhibit. Tell us about this place and what it meant to you.
Well, my stepfather, shortly after he married my mother, was a salesman for the Grand Rapids Varnish Company. And the Varnish Company had a chemist by the name of Doc Schumann, who was a genius. Well, Doc Schumann and my stepfather got together and formed the Ford Paint and Varnish Company. Doc Schumann produced the paint. My stepfather was the salesman and the businessman. And they named it the Ford Paint and Varnish Company. Well, they started it right at the time of the Wall Street crash. So they couldn't have started a new business at a worse time than when it was that, October 1929. Well, both Doc Schumann and my stepfather were hardworking, energetic people, and they scrounged around and got enough capital to build this very modest paint factory, and they went through some very tough times.
In fact, you lost your home, didn't you? Didn't you have to move into another?
My parents lost their home up in East Grand Rapids on Rosewood Avenue. Then they rented a place on Union where I lived from about my 5th grade through my junior year. Our family went through terribly bad economic problems in the Depression, like thousands, millions others did. My dad was very lucky to salvage the paint company.
Now, I'm told it was, the thing he was proudest of was that he never laid any of his workers off.
That's true, but another incident, to pay for our doctor bills, he had to trade paint to the doctor.
Really?
Whether it was my dentist or my general practitioner, that's how we paid our bills. He sold paint to them.
Really?
But they survived, and eventually it turned out to be a nice, small, family-owned business that they never had enough money to put me through college. And actually, when I was in high school, the only cash I got a job working in a hamburg stand across from South High. Bill Scrooge's was the proprietor, a good Greek restaurant owner. I worked from 11:30 to 1, 5 days a week while school was in session. I got paid $2 a week. I got my lunches, and I had to work one night a week from 7 to 10. But $2 a week in 1929, 1930, that was good spending money.
I tell you, behind here, it said, I think you said that there were 3 rules in the Ford household that were absolute. Tell the truth, work hard, and come to dinner on time.
That's right.
I assume there was a lot of love in that house, though, too.
A great deal of it, great deal of it. And it was a house with minimal differences between the parents and the 4 of us, the 4 sons. Had some differences, but again, very minimal.
Now, you spoke of the restaurant where you worked. You had I think what a lot of people would regard as a traumatic experience one day when someone walked into your life that you didn't really know.
Well, I didn't know that my stepfather was not my real father until I was about 12 years old. And then my mother more or less inadvertently admitted it. But it was a one-day incident. One day when I was working at lunch in Bill Scrooge's hamburg stand, my job was to make hamburgs, to work the cash register. I was near the door. A man came in who I didn't know. He stood across in front of the candy display area, kept looking at me, and I was busy working. He finally walked over to me and he said, "Are you Leslie King?" I said, "No." He said, "Well, I'm your father and your name is Leslie King." That really shocked me. He said, "I'm here with my new wife. We live in Wyoming. We came to Detroit to pick up a new Lincoln or Cadillac, I'm not sure which." He said, "We're driving back and I wanted to stop and get acquainted with you. Can you leave your job and go have lunch?" Well, I went to Bill Scrooge's and I said, "Bill, I've got to get away." He said, "Okay." So I took him out to the Cherry Inn. I don't know if you know where the Cherry Inn is, but it was a restaurant out on Wealthy and Cherry. Had lunch, came back, went to work. The hard part was to go home that night and tell my mother and my stepfather what had taken place. But I finally did, and they understood, and that was all that happened at that time.
Now, did you have any further contact with your birth father?
Well, when I was at Yale University coaching football and boxing. I got a job in the summer of 1936 as a ranger at Yellowstone Park. Because my coaching job, I had nothing to do in the summer. So I got Senator Arthur Vandenberg to appoint me as a ranger at Yellowstone Park. On the way out to Yellowstone, I drove. I stopped in Loveland. No, I stopped in Riverton, Colorado, where my stepfather, my real father and his wife lived. I stopped in, had lunch and dinner, and went on. That was the only other time that I saw him.
This drum up here will no doubt bring back memories. And there's a characteristic shot of young Gerald Ford on the gridiron. Tell us about South High and how you came to be there and the role that it really played.
Well, when I grew up and was in high school, we lived on Union Street, 649 Union. It's on the hill there. On one side of us, there was a family who had a son my age. He went to Central. On Paris Street, behind us, were the Engel twins. They both went to Ottawa. In other words, that area was right in the center where you could either go to Central, Ottawa, or South. A very dear friend of my stepfather and my mother was Mr. and Mrs. Ralph Conger. Ralph Conger was the basketball coach at Central, had been for years. But he said one day to my parents, "Where is Jerry going to high school?" And my parents said, "Well, he can go to one of three." And Ralph Conger said, "Jerry should go to South because it is the most democratic, where you have the best diversity of families and students. It's a good school, but it'll give him a better exposure to real life. Central's too elite, it was in those days. Ottawa was the nouveau riche, and South was the down-to-earth, and thank God they did. It was a little longer walk. We had no buses in those days. It was about a 2.5-mile walk, but it was the best advice, and I benefited tremendously.
Football. When did you start playing, and what did it mean to you?
Well, in those days, you went from the 6th grade in an elementary school to the 7th grade in a high school. So South High had the 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th. So I went to South High as a 7th grader. The spring of my 7th grade, they had spring football. I was 13 years old. So I went out to spring practice. And the head coach, Cliff Gettings, was looking around a bunch of motley-looking 7th, 8th graders, and he looked over there and he said, "Hey, Whitey, you're a center." So I got the ball. That's how I became a center. And that fall, we played as 8th graders on the second team, or whatever the term was in those days. So I played 8th grade, 9th grade, on the second team, and then I played varsity 10th, 11th, and 12th.
And was it football that led you to Ann Arbor?
I first went to Ann Arbor they used to have Boy Scouts act as ushers, and I was a Boy Scout, so when I was about 12, our Scout executive took a couple of carloads of kids down to Ann Arbor, and that's when I first saw the Michigan Stadium, and I must admit it inspired me. So I always wanted to go to Michigan. I had an opportunity to get a scholarship to go to Northwestern. I turned it down. I really wanted to go to Michigan right from the beginning, and our coach, Harry Kipke, came and talked to me, took me back to Ann Arbor, and I stayed with him and his wife for a weekend. And I got a lot of extra arm twisting.
So you were recruited.
Oh, yes. In those days, that was legitimate.
Yeah.
But they had no scholarships.
Okay.
All Harry Kipke did was get me a job in the University of Michigan Hospital. I waited on table at the intern's dining room, and I helped clean up the mess in the nurse's cafeteria. 4 hours a day, 40 cents an hour. But I could buy all the food I needed for, what, $1.60. That was during 1931.
What did you learn playing football? I mean, how did it affect your life later?
I finished my senior year at Michigan. I wanted to go to law school. I talked to the Michigan coach. He said, "I'd like to hire you. All I can do is pay you $100. Well, that wouldn't finance my legal education. Just about that time, he got a call from the head coach at Yale, Ducky Pond, who said he wanted to hire an assistant line coach. He asked my coach, did he have anybody to recommend? He said, yes, I've got a young fellow, Jerry Ford. So Ducky Pond came to Ann Arbor. I had lunch with Coach Kipke, Coach Pond, and myself. Pond was interested. He told me to come to Ann Arbor, to New Haven, took the train. I spent a day and a half there. They hired me for $2,400. And I had to learn to be a boxing coach in the meantime, because that was the interval between fall football and spring football. But about that time, I had 2 offers to play pro football. One from the Green Bay Packers, from Curly Lambeau, for $200 a game, and another from Potsy Clark from the Detroit Lions for $200 a game. Even though those 2 contracts would have paid me more, $2,800, than the $2,400 at New Haven. Going to New Haven, to Yale, was a better prospect to go to law school. And at the end of the first football season in '35, the athletic director thought I did a pretty good job, so he gave me a $600 raise to $3,000. And then the next year he did the same to $3,600. So as a single fellow in New Haven, earning $3,600 and going to law school simultaneously, I was doing pretty good.
Now, you always intended, I guess, to come back to Grand Rapids and practice law? Was that?
Well, that was my subjective ambition.
Okay.
I had opportunities when I finished law school to go to Harvard, to go to New York to Philadelphia and work for big law firms, but that didn't appeal to me.
Mr. President, along comes 1941, and you're back in Grand Rapids opening a law firm with Phil Buchan, I think, who would later be with you in the White House. And in common with many folks in this town, including Senator Vandenberg, I guess you were what would be called an isolationist at that time. And Pearl Harbor changed your life along with millions of others.
Isolationism prior to Pearl Harbor was a very common point of view among people in the Middle West. Senator Vandenberg was certainly a strong isolationist. Senator Taft of Ohio, many others in the Senate. I had pretty much the same viewpoint. Well, then we had Pearl Harbor, and the whole political environment changed very dramatically. I immediately applied to the Navy to enter as an officer, and in February, as I recall, I was accepted as an ensign and went to the Naval Academy for a month or 6 weeks of training, and then went to North Carolina to an air aviation training school, and then I applied for sea duty, and I got assigned to the USS Monterey CVL 26, which was a what we call a high-speed carrier, but a smaller one. You see, these hulls were originally laid down as cruiser hulls. Then, early in the war, the United States lost every carrier but one in the battle, I think, at the Coral Sea. So they had to, as quickly as possible, get more carriers out to sea. So they took 9 of these hulls and put flight decks on them, and they got those to sea very quickly. Now, the unfortunate part, they were laid down as cruisers where you had the bridge in the center. When you build a carrier, the area for the captain and everything, the bridge is on the starboard side. Well, they had to put cement in the bulwarks on the port side so to balance it out. But even when we had a full tank of aviation gas, fuel oil, when we would leave Pearl Harbor to go for a month or two at sea, we would list about 3 degrees to the starboard side. Now, I started out as a gunnery officer with the gunnery crew on the fantail, but I got to know the skipper real well, who was a football enthusiast, and a vacancy came up, and I got assigned as an assistant navigator on the bridge with the job of being officer of the deck under general quarters whenever you're under attack or launching planes, etc. So I had a wonderful job. If you're going to be in a war, you might as well be where the action is. And here was about the most action you could get at sea, to be on the bridge of an aircraft carrier.
But you also had some unexpected action in the form of a typhoon.
Well, in December of 1944, just about the time the Navy was going to help support MacArthur to re-land in the Philippines, got caught in a terrible, terrible typhoon. I mean, a huge one. So at the height of the typhoon, I had the officer of the deck at the bridge about midnight. And I'll tell you, that ship was going like this, real rough. I went down at midnight to go to my quarters. I was relieved by another one. At 4 o'clock, we had a general quarters. And so I got out of my sack, which was down about in here, and I started to get on from the catwalk onto the bridge, to the deck, to go back to the bridge, and the ship lurched like that. And it was like a toboggan slide. And I slid across that deck, and thank goodness, landed in the catwalk on the other side instead of going over the side. Well, you know, in wartime and a typhoon, they're going to worry about one sailor missing. There were many other more serious problems. So I was lucky. I got on my feet, went through the area to get back over here, and eventually worked my way to my job on the bridge.
When did the war end for you?
Well, I got transferred back to the States after 2.5 years on the ship in December 25th, 1944. And I was assigned to temporarily in California for 2 months, and then reassigned to a Navy training base in the Chicago area, and I was there till January of '46 when I was discharged.
Let me ask you to jump ahead. Is it an advantage for a president of the United States, based on your own experience, to have served in the military?
I feel very strongly about it. I think a president, having served in the military, is better prepared to be commander-in-chief than someone who never had that experience. Now, that's a strong personal conviction, but I know the experiences I had on this ship for 2.5 years in war made me understand the military better, made me understand the importance of a strong, modern military capability. I was a better president because I served for 2.5 years on that ship.
When you came back to Grand Rapids after the war and resumed your law practice, and apparently got interested in running for office.
First, let me show you. Here's a map of all the places our ship went. So you can see we wandered all over the Pacific for 2.5 years. We were in every one of the island hopping operations, starting with Tarawa, ending up with the Philippines. Yes, you were.
Well, no, a couple things come into your life. Politics and Betty Bloomer.
Right.
The future Mrs. Ford. How did you first meet?
Well, I was back in Grand Rapids practicing law, single, having a few dates here and there, and I was invited to a cocktail party at Tom and Mary Wanty. It was Mary Griswold, really. And I went. It was a nice Saturday afternoon cocktail party. And I noticed a very good-looking girl off in the distance with an attractive hat on. So I sort of moved in that direction and introduced myself. And although we both grew up in Grand Rapids, she was 4.5 years younger, went to a different high school. I had never met her. I just casually met her on that occasion. And then about maybe a month later, I was working with a friend on trying to organize the Kent County Cancer Society fundraiser. And after working from 7 to 10, I said, "Do you know Betty Bloomer?" They said, "Oh, they knew her very well." I said, "How about calling her and I'll take her down to have a drink before we go to bed?" Well, they called and put me on the line. I finally had to twist her arm pretty hard to get her to go. This was 10:15 or so. But that was our first date. We went down to have a drink on the corner of Hall Street and Division. There was a bar on the southwest corner. I've forgotten. It may not be there anymore.
Now, she had been married.
That's
and
right.
had an unhappy experience.
She'd been
with
married
marriage.
3 or 4 years, divorced. So, and I was single and 34, and she was 29.
At that same time, of course, you decided you were going to run for Congress.
About that time.
Okay. And the man you ran against was a dyed-in-the-wool isolationist who was, among other things, I guess this would be a critic of Senator Vandenberg, who really had become your hero at this point.
Right. Well, I had gone to war. I saw the importance of the world as a whole, the importance of friends on a global basis. So when I came back to Grand Rapids, I was an equally ardent internationalist. And our incumbent congressman, Bartel Youngman, was a very dedicated isolationist. I thought we ought to have a new congressman who represented a younger generation with new ideas about U.S. foreign policy. So I decided to run, but there were some prospective other candidates, people more senior to me, probably better known than I. But I went to them one-on-one, and I said, I think we ought to have a new congressman. You are rumored to have a desire to run. I'm curious, are you going to? And 3 of them said no. They said, "Oh, you can't beat Mr. Youngman." And a couple of them said, "Well, if you're so eager, why don't you try it?" So all 3 of them decided not to run. It ended up just a race between Youngman and Ford, which was perfect. And the net result was I won 5-3.
Let me show you, there's a wonderful photo of you on the campaign trail back then, 50 years ago now, which suggests even then you were a man who could be counted upon to keep his word. You're out campaigning in the farm district, and
Right.
you made some promises.
That's a family off 28th Street out near the Beltline. And they were good Republicans, and somehow I said to them, "Can I come out and work on your farm for a week?" And they said, "Sure." So for a week, I went out there and worked. Now the deal was, if I won the nomination, I would come back again and work another week from 4 in the morning till 8 in the morning. And after I got the nomination, I felt obligated to go out there and carry out my commitment.
Were they surprised to see you show up?
I think they were, but they were a wonderful family and ran a good farm.
Now, all this time when you're running for Congress, you had proposed to Mrs. Ford when?
Oh, probably in March of 1948. And we set the wedding date for October 14th, 1948. And
Did you show up late for your wedding? There's this legend.
no, I showed up on time. I walked in, however, with one black shoe and one brown shoe, because that morning, very early, it was dark and I didn't have time or didn't make the effort to see what shoes I was putting on, so I mixed them up a little.
Now, also, I'm told you spent your honeymoon, at least part of your honeymoon, in Owasso, Michigan.
Well, we were married on a Friday at Grace Church. My best man drove us to Ann Arbor to see the Michigan Northwestern football game on Saturday. After the game, Betty and I drove from Ann Arbor to Owasso to hear candidate Tom Dewey make a big hometown speech. He came from Owasso. After that speech, about 10 o'clock, we drove to Detroit, and we spent our wedding day afterwards in Detroit. And then the next day, Monday, we drove back to Grand Rapids. And when I got to Grand Rapids about 7 o'clock at night, I said, Betty, I've got a political speech. So our first 3 or 4 days of wedding was pretty short.
Has she ever let you forget?
No, I've paid it off many times, many times.
Okay.
But I'm delighted and honored.
Mr. President, you would have a long and perhaps to some people surprisingly close relationship with another young congressman from the Democratic Party named Jack Kennedy. How did that relationship begin?
Jack Kennedy was first elected to the Congress in 1946. I was elected 2 years later in 1948. When he was sworn in January of 47, he was assigned an office over in what we call the Old House Office Building. When I came 2 years later, I was assigned an office in the same building, and by pure happenstance, our offices were opposite one another on the same corridor. Well, day after day after day, his staff and my staff worked together, day after day after day for the first 4 years. We walked back and forth to the House chamber. So I became well acquainted with Jack Kennedy at a time when he was still a member of the House of Representatives. So we developed, I would say, a good, warm, very understanding relationship.
And so there's a certain amount of irony in that a generation later you would be called upon to serve as part of the Warren Commission that would investigate the death of President Kennedy. How were you recruited for the commission?
Well, President Kennedy, as I recall, was killed on a Friday in Dallas. It was shocking. It was hard to comprehend. 2 days later, either Sunday or Monday, Betty and I were home, and I got a telephone call from the White House. It was President Johnson. He said, Jerry, I'm putting together a panel to investigate the assassination of President Kennedy. I want a bipartisan membership. I've gotten the Chief Justice. I've gotten Senator Russell of Georgia, John Sherman Cooper of of Kentucky. I've got Hale Boggs from New Orleans. I want you to be the Republican. I said, Mr. President, I've got many tough responsibilities in Congress. I don't think I can have the time. Well, Lyndon, in his typical way, twisted my arm, and I said yes. So I served for the next 15 months on the Warren Commission, along with 6 others. And as of today, February 23, 1998, I'm the sole surviving member of that commission.
Now, obviously, over the years, there's been a lot of doubts cast upon the Commission's methods and its findings. In fact, you probably could say that a majority of Americans today question the lone gunman theory. But you have not changed your view over the years that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. Is that true?
I strongly reaffirm the 2 basic decisions of the Warren Commission. Number 1, Lee Harvey Oswald committed the assassination. Second, the Commission found no evidence of a conspiracy, foreign or domestic. I add, I have seen no new evidence that would contradict either of those judgments of the Commission.
So all of the theorizing, most recently by Seymour Hersh, for example, mafia connections, the plot to assassinate Castro, all of this, which obviously was unknown to you at the time, has not changed your basic viewpoint about the...
Oliver Stone was wrong. Mark Lane was wrong in his book. I said a minute ago, and I repeat, I have seen no new credible evidence that would change my view, or I think the view of the Commission.
And how did the Commission work? When you got to the point of writing the report, was there internal debate, discussion, fine-tuning your findings? How did you get to the final conclusions?
We had an outstanding staff of about 20 people. When we got all through the hearings, they prepared a rough draft of a proposed statement for the Commission. The Commission went through it with a fine-tooth comb, and we made several important changes. For example, the staff wrote, there was no evidence of a conspiracy, foreign or domestic. The Commission changed it. We said the Commission found no evidence, which is a significant difference. So I would say we had a fine staff, but we had an independent commission. And I honestly believe the Commission's determination is better today than it was in 1964. And I might add, people are still theorizing about Abraham Lincoln's assassination. So you'll have challenges to the Warren Commission ad infinitum.
One particular point of controversy, then we'll leave the subject, because it appeared in the press not that long ago. I guess there was some debate over the exact entry location of the wound in the president's head, or neck, actually.
Well, there were 3 shots fired from the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository. One didn't hit anything. The first shot was one that went in the shoulder and neck of Kennedy, and that's the one that went through him and hit John Conley and was subsequently found, I believe, on the stretcher that was taken to the hospital. The third shot is the one that hit Kennedy in the skull and demolished his skull. So there is considerable controversy about the validity of this, the single bullet killing of Kennedy, because it did, even though it went through him, undoubtedly actually brought about his death. The one that hit his skull, of course, demolished it.
Over the years, there's been some good-natured play, I guess, over your relationship with Lyndon Johnson. LBJ made a few comments over the years that were a bit biting. And yet you, and of course, as leader of the opposition, after 1965, you got in your own licks. What's your own recollections of LBJ?
LBJ was a tough, aggressive, highly motivated Democrat politician. And he didn't like Republicans to challenge him, and he didn't like Republican leaders like myself to interfere with his legislative ambitions. And my job as the Republican leader was to come up with alternative solutions to country's problems. So we had head-to-head confrontations, but I must say, we learned to disagree without being disagreeable. And when it was all through and he was about to leave Washington, Lyndon called me down to the Oval Office for just a little chat. And he came about as close as Lyndon Johnson ever could be to apologizing.
Really?
It was a wonderful half-hour friendship conference. So I have nothing but, admiration for his talent. I got mad when he was a little rough, but on the bottom line, he was a good guy.
Do you think he's a tragic figure because of
Could be.
Vietnam?
He could be. His wife, Lady Bird, is a beautiful gem, however.
Yeah.
A very good friend of Betty and me.
And those are friendships that you keep for life?
Oh, yes. We see Lady Bird, communicate with her.
The scene behind you, of course, is another congressional scene. This is your vice presidential hearings.
Right.
In the fall of '73. And I take it the White House had briefed you pretty thoroughly on some of the questions, not all of them friendly, that you might be asked. What was that experience like, going before, in effect, your own colleagues? And I think you were probably subjected to the most thorough investigation of any candidate for office.
Well, it was the first use of the 25th Amendment. And therefore, the Congress, which was Democrat-controlled, wanted to make sure that it was done properly and fully. So they got the FBI, I think around 500 agents, checked my record from birth to the present. The Internal Revenue Code, or the Internal Revenue Service, went through all of my income tax returns for, as I recall, 10 years. They went through my checkbook page by page by page. So I had a pretty thorough investigation, and when they got all through, the only things that they questioned, the IRS. In 1968, I had been the Republican National Convention chairman in Miami. I went out and bought 2 summer suits, I think for $150 a piece, so I could look nice at that convention when I was running the convention. I thought that was a legitimate business expense. The IRS disallowed it, and that was the only thing in all the checking they did that they found I had inaccurately, in their judgment, handle my federal taxes.
Now, you were confirmed as vice president by both houses of
Right.
Congress?
I got 97-3 in the Senate, and I got about 434 in the House.
And I understand, now tell me if I've been misinformed, Bella Abzug was not your biggest fan.
She was an unusual member of the House. I don't think she voted for me.
Yeah.
The only black vote I got was, the former mayor from Atlanta. What's his name? Very good man. He later was the head of the UN.
Andrew Young.
Andrew Young.
Sure.
Yeah. Andrew Young was a very good friend of mine, and he voted for me. I won 435 and 97-3. That's not a bad scorecard.
Not in a democracy.
Not when the opposition controls the Congress.
That's true. Now, we come to the final days of the Nixon presidency. And at what point did you realize that you, in fact, were going to be president of the United States?
Probably on the Friday preceding the Friday that I did become president.
Yeah.
I was in my vice president's office. Al Haig, who was Nixon's chief of staff, called and said he had to see me as quickly as possible. He came to my vice president's office and laid out the fact that the smoking gun tape, which would show the cover-up by Nixon, would be released, I believe, the following Monday. Al Haig said that smoking gun tape will do one of two things. It will convince Nixon to resign, or if he doesn't resign, it'll be the catalyst that will bring about his impeachment and eventual conviction. So with that hard-nosed assessment by Al Haig, it became obvious to me that I was probably going to be president. Now, in the meantime, the Congress had turned the Admiral's house over to the Vice President to be an official residence. My wife Betty was up there that afternoon trying to pick out some new things so we could move into it in the next week or two as Vice President. She asked me to come and join her to help pick out some shades and whatever else. Well, I dutifully went, knowing full well what Al Haig had told me. But I said, oh, that'll look nice, Betty. This will be very attractive, Betty. When we left to go home that afternoon, I said, Betty, you can cancel any plans you have to live in the Vice President's house. I don't think that's going to happen. The odds are we'll end up in the White House.
And what was her reaction?
Well, I don't recall precisely. She was always cautious because she'd seen things slip between the cracks in the past. Although that night, when we went to bed, I can say without being embarrassed, we held hands and prayed that if it did take place, we would commit to do the very best job possible.
Now, throughout this whole period, had you been advising the president on how to respond to the allegations?
I strictly stayed away from any discussion or involvement in the Watergate fiasco. I made comments, recommendations involving what we should do in Vietnam, but I did not think it appropriate to discuss Watergate. In the first place, John Mitchell and President Nixon had reassured me direct, face to face, that they were not involved in the break-in, they had no knowledge of it, etc. So rather than pursue beyond that, I stayed at arm's length from any discussion of Watergate.
And was it the smoking gun tape, as it's come to be known, that finally convinced you that, let's face it, they hadn't told you the truth?
I would say yes, because it was very persuasive evidence.
Now, at the same time, all the historical accounts indicate that in that last week of the Nixon presidency, really the president could have gone either way. I mean, he could have dug his heels in. I mean, it must have put you in a terribly awkward position, knowing what you knew, and at the same time not knowing whether, in fact, the president had any intention of voluntarily going.
There was a deep division within the Nixon family, I'm told. Some wanted him to fight it out, some wanted him to resign. So it was not a clear-cut decision until the very last minute when he asked me to come and meet him personally in the Oval Office, where he said that he was resigning the next day. He wished me well. We talked about some policy matters. He urged me to keep Henry Kissinger on and Bill Simon on as cabinet officers. It was...
Was it an emotional meeting?
It was. It had to be. After all, I'd known him intimately for 20-plus years, and I thought then, and I still think now, in foreign policy, he was as good, if not better, than any American president in this century.
Did you feel any sense of betrayal, even of embarrassment at having defended the administration when you really hadn't been told all the facts?
I was deeply disappointed that I had not been told right from the outset the full facts. But at that late stage, it didn't seem necessary to be critical. Things were happening, and to have recrimination at that point was, I thought, unwise.
And I assume that in the 20 years that remained of President Nixon's life, you never had a Watergate discussion.
I stayed scrupulously away from it. It was another issue that, why talk about a tragedy? Talk about the future and the good things.
Now, on August 8th, the president resigns, or I'm sorry, declares his intention to resign from the Oval Office. And in his speech, he said that you would be sworn in the next day in that office. And of course, you were sworn in the East Room. How did that change of plans come about?
I don't remember why that took place, except I suspect I wanted it in the East Room because I felt it would be a different inauguration. And it ought to be an inauguration where some friends and other individuals ought to be present. And the Oval Office is relatively small. The East Room is big enough so you could have 300 or 400 people, which I thought was a proper way for my taking the oath of office.
And the most famous line in your inaugural address, I understood, almost didn't get used. Is that true?
Well, we didn't start writing my acceptance speech until 24 hours before I became president. Bob Hartman was my speechwriter, and a darn good one. And he worked on it virtually all night long, brought it into my vice president's office about 7:30 in the morning, and I read it for the first time. And I got to this famous line, "Our long national nightmare is over." I said, "Bob, I'm not sure I want to say that." And Bob Hartman, who can be very arbitrary, picked up the paper, started to walk out of my office, and he said, "If you won't use that line, I'm quitting." Well, I said, "Bring it back and we'll go over." Well, I left it in, and it turned out to be the best, most remembered line of the speech.
In all my public and private acts as your president, I expect to follow my instincts of openness and candor with full confidence that honesty is always the best policy in the end. My fellow Americans, our long national nightmare is over. Our Constitution works. Our great republic is a government of laws and not of men. Here, the people rule. But there is a higher power. By whatever name, we honor him, who ordains not only righteousness but love, not only justice but mercy.
And what was Mrs. Ford's mood that day? I remember bringing her through here, and we looked at the videotape of the departure ceremony on the South Lawn. And frankly, if you look at that videotape, it almost looks as if she's the one getting on the helicopter instead of Pat Nixon. And she said she still couldn't watch that it was the worst day of her life.
I think it was probably the worst day of both of our lives, although I was less reflective of it. It was tough to say goodbye to two very close, dear friends who you've known for years, people you've been with socially, politically, and otherwise. And unfortunately, because of a couple of stupid mistakes, their whole lives had to be totally changed. So it was that walk from the White House to the helicopter with the Nixons was a heart-rending experience. So when we stepped back and waved goodbye, you couldn't help but have a tear in your eye.
And when you walked back into that White House, you walked into an office for which you'd had no transition. You really had no staff of your own. You had to pick a vice president. You had, obviously, Richard Nixon's continuing presence, problems. What was that first month like? How do you create a presidency from scratch?
Well, I was very, very fortunate, having been a leader in the House for 9 years and in Congress, where I had jobs that brought me to the White House for cabinet meetings, NSC meetings, etc. So I was familiar with the West Wing of the White House. I was familiar with how presidents handled cabinet meetings, NSC meetings. I was not like walking in from the street and all of a sudden taking over. So I was very confident that I was well prepared. It was just a matter of putting my own imprimatur on the new administration. So it went relatively well. We had to pick a new vice president, and I think I handled that process very well. He turned out to be a good vice president.
Although unpopular with some in your own party.
That's right. He was much too liberal for the hard right element, but his presence gave a good balance to my administration. He had been a governor. I had not had that experience. He had been active in the State Department under President Roosevelt. So he was a well-rounded individual, and he had no particular personal ambitions. So he was a good choice.
Were you surprised in those first few weeks at the continuing almost obsession of the press corps in particular with Richard Nixon and Richard Nixon's papers and Richard Nixon's legal prospects? And I mean, how did...
Well, the first major press conference I had, as I recall, 90% of the questions from the White House press corps were, what was I going to do about Mr. Nixon's papers, Mr. Nixon's tape? What was I going to do about him? Was I going to pardon him, etc.? When that press conference ended, I walked back to the Oval Office. I was furious. I said, we've got an economic recession on our doorstep. I've got a date very soon with Mr. Brezhnev in Vladivostok. We've got inflation high, interest rates are high. We had all kinds of major problems, and the press was spending 90% of his time on Mr. Nixon's problems. At that point, when I walked into the Oval Office, is when I decided I was going to pardon Mr. Nixon.
And did people try to talk you out of it?
Oh, I only talked to about 6 staff members, my most intimate members, and none of them were for it. But that was a judgment I made on my own, and it was right. It was right then, and it's even more right today.
Do you think it cost you the '76 election?
It's a factor. When you lose by 1.5 percentage points, any major issue like the pardon could be the factor. It probably had an impact. Did
Richard Nixon ever thank you?
Not directly. That was not his nature. That didn't bother me. I did it for reasons that I thought were good. If he was grateful, it wasn't necessary to express it verbally to me.
Mr. President, the foreign policy gallery here is dominated by a Vietnam-era Huey helicopter, which is figuratively sitting on the roof of the American Embassy, which will recall what you have called the saddest day of your presidency. If you could tell us about April of 1975.
Well, when I became president, there had been an agreement between the North Vietnamese and President Nixon to end the war in Vietnam. The North Koreans were to withdraw from South Korea. The prisoners were to be released. The combat was to be stopped. Well, unfortunately, the North Vietnamese did not live up to the terms of the agreement. They kept their troops in South Vietnam. They kept the fighting going. The only thing they abided by, they did release the American prisoners. Well, when I became president, the war had disintegrated seriously. It was obvious the North Vietnamese were winning. I asked the Congress to give us more money for ammunition, for equipment for the South Vietnamese so they could save their land, but Congress lost its guts and turned me down. So the net result was, come April, May of 1975, the North Vietnamese were literally surrounding Saigon. And at that point, I ordered the Secretary of Defense, Jim Schlesinger, to maximize the evacuation of all U.S. military personnel, and I ordered him to evacuate as many of the South Vietnamese who had fought with us as our allies. Well, unfortunately, for various reasons, those orders were not carried out as effectively as they should have been. So here we were, unable to defend Saigon and the North Vietnamese surrounding Saigon. So in May, forgotten the precise date, I sat in the Oval Office and saw the American military being evacuated by this kind of a helicopter.
Is that the image right overhead?
That's right. That's a picture of it. And as many South Vietnamese civilians who had been our allies. We had 2 or 3 aircraft carriers out in the ocean so that these helicopters could take as many as possible, transfer them to the flight decks, then return and pick up some more. They did that for almost 24 hours in a row. We rescued, I think, all U.S. military personnel and thousands of South Vietnamese. Now, our ambassador named Martin was a hardliner. He never wanted to quit the war. He thought we could still hang on and eventually win. I finally had to order him to take a helicopter and leave the American embassy. It was a sad day to sit in the Oval Office and see on television the American troops being literally kicked out of an American embassy before it surrendered. I hope no American president goes through that experience again.
And then, as if to make things even worse, Congress wanted to renege on your effort to resettle as many Vietnamese refugees in this country as possible.
I strongly felt that these thousands of South Vietnamese who had fought with our American GIs over a period of several years should be given an opportunity to come to the United States. After all, they had been buddies with Americans in the battlefield fighting for the same cause. I felt so strongly that they ought to be given the right to come to the United States and start a new life. Well, we had a knockdown, drag-out fight. I finally prevailed in the main. And as a consequence, today, we have many outstanding Vietnamese who are now citizens of this country and good contributing members of our society.
And what about those people who still say, we could have and should have won the Vietnam War?
Well, by the time I became president, the odds of us winning were very, very low. Early in the war, I think with a stronger air effort, with a stronger ground effort, we could have brought about a peace that would have been more acceptable. But by the time I became president, the situation had deteriorated so badly. There was no way we could strengthen the South Vietnamese. By that time, most of our U.S. military had been withdrawn. It was a losing battle and a tragic end.
Did you ever say to him, you really weren't very good today?
Yes, I do. I'm probably his world's either worst or best critic.
This interview caused you some problems, didn't it?
Well, this interview was surprising. In particular, the question about our daughter and so forth. I must say in good humor, I kidded her that her answer would probably cost me, I think, 20 million votes. It was all said in jest.
Right.
The press carried it as though it was a serious condemnation. She and I have a good rapport, bickering back and forth, kidding one another back and forth. She understood that I was doing it as a quip, not as some serious criticism. The truth is, at first, as a result of her comment, the Mail was critical of her. But within a week, the Mail that came to her office supported her about 5-1 over the criticism. So I think that was good evidence that by speaking her mind and being honest and truthful, it paid off, and it produced some good PR.
Well, in fact, by 1976, there were campaign buttons that read, "Betty's husband for president." How did you feel when you saw those?
Oh, I thought that was wonderful. We were scrounging around for as many votes as possible, and obviously she was being very helpful. She went down to Texas and got on this telephone line that the truckers used. And
Oh, the CB...
whatever it is.
Yeah.
And she, for about an hour, talked to all the Texas truckers, and
She became First Mama. That was
First
her.
Mama, that's
Yeah.
right. Yeah.
Did she enjoy the White
yeah.
House?
She enjoyed the White House, the opportunities, and she truly enjoyed trying to be helpful in the campaign.
And when the breast cancer surgery came along, and was there ever any doubt that that would be made public?
No, knowing Betty, it was obvious right from the very, very beginning that when the surgery was done and the problem was solved, that the only answer was to be public about it. The interesting thing was we always had golden retriever dogs when we were having our children grow up. And unfortunately, the second one was poisoned just before we came to the White House. So we went to the White House without a dog. Well, she had her cancer surgery 3 weeks after we were in the White House. And our daughter Susan and our photographer David Kennerly thought it would be a good idea to get a new dog to give to her the day she came back from the hospital. So they had to call all over the country to find a litter of golden retriever puppies. They finally found one in Minneapolis. And they talked to this man, and they said they wanted to buy one of his puppies. He said, well, what kind of a house will the dog have? We don't sell our puppies to anybody. Well, they said, it's a big house. And he said, well, has it got plenty of room? And they went on this dialogue for about 10 minutes and finally admitted that it was the White House and so forth. And that's how literally Liberty got there. And she eventually had 9 puppies in the White House.
Now, that obviously was one of the worst days for Mrs. Ford in the White House, the discovery of her breast cancer. Another one came in September of '75, and that involved you and a young woman by the name of Squeaky Fromm. In fact, this is Squeaky's weapon. And there you are, I think in Sacramento.
Right. Well, I had gone to Sacramento to make a speech to the California Chamber of Commerce in the morning at a breakfast. When the breakfast was over, I had agreed to walk from the hotel across the Capitol lawn to pay a courtesy call to Jerry Brown, the Democratic governor. As I walked on the path, there were people on both sides I was shaking hands with. And as I was shaking hands, I noticed a woman in a red dress moving along as I went this way. And finally, as we got close to the Capitol, I went to shake hands, and here this woman with a red dress had her hand through behind some others, but had a pistol in her hand, and my hand was that close to her hand. And Jerry, head of my Secret Service detail, noticed it, Larry Boondorf, and he grabbed the pistol just before she was about to pull the trigger and kept it from going off. Boondorf literally saved my life, because another fraction of a second she would have pulled the trigger and the pistol was 3 feet from my body. So we were glad to have her in prison.
And then a month later, it happens all over again.
Well, a month later, I was making a speech in San Francisco at one of the big hotels there. And after the speech, I got in the limousine, or was about to get in the limousine to go to the airport, and a shot was fired from across the streets. And fortunately, a Marine standing next to Sarah Jane Moore saw her with a pistol and hit her hand, and the shot went over my head by about 6 feet and lodged in the St. Francis Hotel. The interesting thing there was the agents jammed me in the back seat of the car, and we took off to drive to the airport at about 90 miles an hour. We got to the airport early. Betty was flying up from Pebble Beach. She was late because we had gotten there more quickly. She didn't know what was all the excitement was about, because the lines were all tied up. She gets out of her plane, walks up the ramp, walks into the plane where I'm sitting with Don Rumsfeld and 2 or 3 others. She walks in and said, "Well, how did they treat you in San Francisco?" So that was...
Now, being wrestled to the ground became sort of a catchphrase, especially on Saturday Night Live. And I think your press secretary actually appeared on Saturday Night Live.
Ron Nesson did.
And of course, Chevy Chase is indelibly linked with you. How did all that come about, and did you find it funny?
Frankly, I had never watched Saturday Night Live. I kept getting these stories about how they were making fun of me and my administration. I really didn't pay much attention to it. I later got to know Chevy Chase. He's a very nice person. He's no longer doing Saturday Night Live. As a matter of fact, on a personal basis, Saturday Night Live never really bothered me.
Did you think, though, you got a bum rap, the reputation for falling? And because you're probably the best athlete who's ever been in the White House.
Well, I was.
Well.
But it never really bothered me that they used to give me a hard time. And most of the press didn't do it. It was just the smart-ass part of the press that I thought that wanted to somehow enhance themselves that did it. But that's just part of the way you have to face life in the political arena.
So do you sympathize with other presidents who get caricatured, stereotyped, or whatever?
I understand their attitude 100%. They might as well relax and enjoy it.
One bit of controversy, almost as controversial as the pardon. In fact, in your first month, I think, as president, you announced a Vietnam amnesty program, which was designed to give draft evaders an opportunity, I think as you put it, to work their way back into American society, and it was not well received, particularly among a number of former soldiers, some of whom sent Purple Hearts, and in one case an entire uniform, in protest to the White House.
Well, I decided that if we could develop a program so that these draft evaders who'd gone to Canada or elsewhere could come back, admit their mistake, and sign up to do work over a period of time, that could clear their record. I thought it was a good program then, and I think in history it will be recorded as a good program. We got very important people to serve on the commission. Father Ted Hesburgh of Notre Dame, Vernon Jordan, who was then the head of the NAACP. We got a Marine general. We had a commission of about 8 people who went through the records, and when they got all through, they set up programs for about 30,000 people who had tried to evade the draft, who came back and earned their way back and cleared their record.
After the controversies of your first months in office, the bicentennial must have been doubly welcome. It really was a great national birthday party.
It was a magnificent 4th of July, 1976. The tall ships in New York Harbor. I went to Philadelphia. I went where George Washington crossed the Delaware with his troops. It was a busy but a wonderful day to remember, to pay tribute and honor to our country's 200th birthday.
You must have felt some pride. Obviously, the mood of the country in the summer of '76 was very different from what it had been in the summer of '74.
Sure was. It, well, things had all turned for the better. The economy was prospering. We had made progress in our negotiations with the Soviets. We had made some headway in the Middle East with the Egyptians and the Israelis. We had done well with the Japanese in the Pacific Basin. The American people had a much healthier point of view of how things were in our own country. So July 4, 1976 was really a fantastic day of celebration.
But it wasn't enough to keep someone from running against you for the Republican nomination, Ronald Reagan by name.
Right.
Were you surprised when Reagan decided to run? Had you had any indication prior to his announcement that in fact he
I had
would be
heard
opposing
some rumors to the effect that he would be a candidate. I strongly hoped he would not, because I thought we had done a good job. We had turned things around. We were on the way to a very healthy economy, good international relations. But he turned out to be a very tough candidate. We whipped him in Kansas City by about 150 votes after a very bitter pre-convention contest.
And Nelson Rockefeller pulled out of the race. Was that something? Is that something you regret in retrospect? Or?
Well, I have mixed emotions about it. I would have preferred to keep him on the ticket, and I think he would have preferred to be on the ticket. But the practical realities were, and we had to be realistic, if he had stayed on the ballot, I probably would not have been the nominee. Reagan would have won the nomination. So Nelson Rockefeller made the very unselfish decision that he would step aside in order to ensure that I would get the nomination. And it turned out that way. And the net result was I picked Bob Dole, and when we left Kansas City, we were 34 points behind Jimmy Carter. But when the votes were finally cast in November, we only lost by 1.5 percentage points. So we put up a good campaign, made a few mistakes, but
Would it have made a difference if Reagan had been on the ticket? Was that a possibility?
I was told not to ask him to be on the ticket. I was asked by his top advisors, do not ask Governor Reagan to be on the ticket. So in deference to their admonition, I did not ask him. He might have made a difference. I think if he had campaigned hard for me in 3 or 4 states, Mississippi being one, probably Wisconsin another, Missouri another, we could have won. He did not campaign hard at all. He did participate in a big fundraiser in LA, but he was not out on the campaign trail, which would have been very helpful.
And finally, looking back on that 76 campaign, coming so close, 20 years later, do you replay it in your mind, or do you put it behind you and move on? Or
I've always been one, whether in athletics where you lose a game by a mistake or an error, or a political campaign where you lose by a narrow margin. There's no point sitting around moaning and groaning about your loss. Think about what you can do the next day or the next month. The things you can do to have a new life, a new activity. So yes, we lost, but both Betty and I moved on, and we've had a happy 20 years since then.
one last question, Mr. President. You have a birthday coming up in July. I wonder if you mind telling us which one that is.
July 14th will be my 85th birthday. But overall, the Ford family has a lot of things happening in 1998. It'll be my 85th birthday, Betty's 80th birthday in April, our 50th wedding anniversary in October of this year, and 1998 is the 50th anniversary of my first election to Congress. So we're going to do some celebrating, but it'll be a very memorable year in our very wonderful lifetime.
Well, thanks for sharing it with us, and many more birthdays.
Thank you. Thank you.
This New Year's